Harlem breathed differently in the late autumn of 1934, the air cool enough to sharpen every sound, every rumor, every glance exchanged beneath the street lamps that painted Lenox Avenue gold. Jazz spilled from open doors, laughter drifted up from crowded stoops, and yet beneath the rhythm lived a tension most outsiders could not see. It was the tension of people who had learned to carry dignity like armor, walking upright even when the world seemed determined to push them down. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson moved through the neighborhood with the quiet composure of a man who understood both its beauty and its burden. His coat was pressed, his hat low, and his presence commanded respect not through fear but through steadiness. Those who crossed his path felt something grounding in his gaze, as though he saw beyond the chaos of the streets and into the deeper story unfolding beneath them. The previous weeks had left Harlem unsettled. Murmurs of harassment and humiliation whispered through barbershops and cafes, stories that traveled faster than newspapers but carried heavier weight. People spoke of outsiders bringing old hatreds into a neighborhood that had fought too long for its voice to be silenced again. Bumpy listened more than he spoke, absorbing each account with patience, measuring every word before responding. He knew that anger, while justified, could become a trap if it led people toward actions that stripped them of the dignity they fought to protect. Instead, he encouraged calm resolve, reminding those around him that true strength was often quiet. A young boy ran down the sidewalk clutching a folded note, his breath uneven from fear. He handed it to a shopkeeper who read it silently before his face hardened with concern. The note passed quickly from hand to hand until it reached Bumpy, who unfolded it carefully, his expression unchanged even as the words described an act of cruelty meant to intimidate the community. He folded the paper again with deliberate calm, slipping it into his pocket without a word. Those standing nearby expected anger or commands, but instead he simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of the moment without allowing it to define him. It was this composure that drew people closer to him, not because he promised easy answers, but because he carried himself as though justice was still possible in a world that often forgot its meaning. Across town, Dutch Schultz lingered in a smoky lounge, his reputation preceding him wherever he went. To many in Harlem, his name represented an uneasy past filled with rivalry and suspicion. Yet beneath the sharp suits and guarded demeanor lived a man watching the same changes unfold, sensing that the old rules of power were shifting in ways neither side fully understood. When word reached him of rising tensions, he made an unexpected decision to walk openly through Harlem, not to provoke, but to observe. People watched him cautiously, unsure whether to expect confrontation or indifference, and the silence that followed him down the street felt heavier than any shouted insult. Their first meeting after months of distance happened outside a small bookstore, where jazz records played softly behind dusty glass. Bumpy stood beneath the awning, rain tapping gently against the pavement when Dutch approached. For a moment neither man spoke, the history between them hanging in the air like an unspoken question. Then Bumpy extended a hand, not in surrender or dominance but in acknowledgement that the moment required something larger than pride. Dutch accepted it, his expression thoughtful, as if recognizing that the man before him had chosen dignity over rivalry. Their conversation remained brief, measured, and respectful, focusing not on past disputes, but on the responsibility each carried in a city watching their every move. As days passed, Harlem's mood shifted from unease to quiet vigilance. Church bells rang longer than usual, sermons carried deeper urgency, and neighbors checked on one another with subtle gestures that spoke louder than words. Bumpy visited local businesses one by one, speaking with owners about maintaining calm and unity, reminding them that their strength lay not in reacting to provocation, but in standing together. He carried himself like a guardian of the neighborhood's spirit, refusing to allow fear to dictate the tone of its future. Even those who disagreed with his methods respected the way he refused to let anger erode his sense of honor. One evening, a crowd gathered outside a cafe where a heated argument threatened to spiral into something darker. A man shouted accusations, his voice trembling with frustration, while others tried to calm him. Bumpy stepped into the circle slowly, his presence alone enough to soften the tension. He spoke quietly, asking the man to sit and share his story without raising his voice. The crowd leaned closer, drawn by the calm authority in his tone, and the argument dissolved into conversation. It was not a dramatic victory, but it demonstrated something powerful, that respect could disarm conflict more effectively than force ever could. Meanwhile, Dutch found himself observing Bumpy from a distance, intrigued by the way people responded to him. Yet here was a man who commanded loyalty without intimidation. One night, Dutch approached him again, this time offering information he had heard from sources beyond Harlem rumors, of individuals attempting to exploit racial tensions for their own gain, hoping chaos would distract from their schemes. Bumpy listened carefully, weighing the truth behind the words, and thanked him with a simple nod. Their alliance remained cautious, built not on trust alone, but on a shared understanding that the city stood at a fragile crossroads. As autumn deepened, the injustice that had sparked whispers grew impossible to ignore. Community leaders debated how to respond, some urging loud demonstrations, while others feared escalating tensions further. Bumpy attended these meetings without dominating them, allowing voices from every corner of Harlem to be heard. When he did speak, he emphasized the power of unity and the importance of refusing to become what others expected them to be. His words carried the weight of lived experience, reminding everyone present that dignity was not weakness, but a form of strength that could reshape even the harshest narrative. One night, after leaving a late gathering, Bumpy walked alone along a quiet stretch of street illuminated by flickering lamps. The city's noise faded into a distant hum, and he paused to watch a group of children playing hopscotch under the watchful eyes of their parents. For a moment, the heaviness lifted, replaced by a reminder of why the struggle mattered. Harlem was not just a battleground of ideas and conflicts. It was a home filled with laughter, music, and dreams that deserved protection. He adjusted his hat and continued walking, his steps steady, his mind already turning toward the challenges he sensed were approaching. Dutch watched from across the street, leaning against a parked car, his usual bravado softened by reflection. He had seen many men claim power, but few carried it with such restraint. Something about Bumpy's approach unsettled and inspired him at the same time, forcing him to reconsider the meaning of influence in a world defined by division. As Bumpy disappeared into the shadows, Dutch remained still, listening to the distant sound of a trumpet drifting through an open window, wondering whether the city itself was preparing for a turning point neither of them could yet see. The days that followed felt like the slow tightening of a knot. Newspapers hinted at unrest without understanding its roots, and outsiders began to treat Harlem as though it were a spectacle rather than a community. Bumpy refused to let frustration dictate his actions, choosing instead to meet with pastors, business owners, and young activists, weaving together a network of voices that could not easily be dismissed. He believed that change did not begin with grand gestures, but with small acts of courage repeated, until they became impossible to ignore. Late one evening, he returned to the bookstore where he had first spoken with Dutch weeks earlier. The rain had returned, soft and steady, reflecting the city's lights like scattered stars. Dutch joined him there again, this time without hesitation, and the two men stood side by side, watching people hurry past under shared umbrellas. Spoke about the weight of leadership, about how easy it was to let pride become a barrier to understanding, and about the responsibility they carried, whether they welcomed it or not. Their conversation ended not with a handshake, but with a quiet understanding that the path ahead would demand more patience than either had ever shown before. Harlem continued to pulse with life, despite the uncertainty. Music echoing through nightclubs, laughter rising from crowded apartments, and hope flickering in places outsiders rarely looked. Yet beneath it all, something deeper stirred, a question waiting for an answer that had not yet arrived. Bumpy sensed that the coming days would test not only his resolve, but the spirit of the entire neighborhood. As he walked home under the glow of a fading street lamp, he carried himself with the same calm dignity that had defined him from the start, unaware that the choices he would soon make would shape not only Harlem's future, but the way the city itself understood justice. Harlem no longer felt like it belonged entirely to its own people. The music still played, and the cafes still glowed under warm lights, yet something unseen moved beneath the surface, a quiet pressure that made strangers linger too long at corners and patrol cars roll past more often than usual. In the days following the fragile calm that Bumpy Johnson had helped restore, new whispers began to coil through the neighborhood, not loud enough to spark open fear, but heavy enough to make conversations pause whenever unfamiliar footsteps approached. Shop owners found their windows smeared with chalk symbols no one admitted to understanding, and elders who had witnessed too many seasons of injustice recognized the pattern immediately. It was not chaos yet, but it was a warning, the kind that crept slowly into a community's bones before anyone dared to name it. Bumpy moved through the streets with the same composed presence that had guided Harlem through the previous turmoil. Yet those closest to him noticed the slight tightening of his jaw when he listened to the latest reports. He never rushed his responses. He allowed each person to speak fully, whether they were frightened teenagers or aging ministers who remembered older battles fought with fewer witnesses. He carried himself like a man holding a fragile lantern against a growing wind, determined to keep the flame steady no matter how fiercely the air shifted around him. People followed his lead without being told, lowering their voices, watching more closely, waiting for him to reveal whether this tension would pass like a storm or demand something deeper from them all. Dutch Schultz arrived again in Harlem, not as an intruder, but as a quiet observer walking along the edge of a neighborhood that still measured him with cautious eyes. His reputation lingered like a shadow, yet his demeanor had changed since the last time he stood beside Bumpy beneath a flickering awning. Instead of sharp gestures and restless energy, he carried a thoughtful stillness, as if the weight of recent events had forced him to reconsider the meaning of influence. He approached Bumpy one evening outside a jazz club where a trumpet cried through the open doorway, the music carrying a sadness that mirrored the city's mood. Without preamble, Dutch shared what he had heard from circles beyond Harlem, rumors that powerful figures hoped to provoke unrest, believing that chaos would justify heavier control over neighborhoods already struggling for respect. Bumpy listened. Without interrupting, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed despite the gravity of the information. He did not respond with anger or alarm. Instead, he thanked Dutch quietly and suggested they walk, allowing the rhythm of the streets to guide their thoughts. As they moved past glowing storefronts and clusters of people speaking in hushed tones, the contrast between their histories and their present alliance felt almost surreal. Two men shaped by very different worlds now walked side by side, not as rivals but as reluctant partners navigating a city that seemed determined to misunderstand them both. Those who watched from a distance sensed that something significant was unfolding, though few could have explained why the sight of them together felt both unsettling and strangely hopeful. The tension deepened when a respected community organizer was publicly humiliated during a routine inspection that many believed was designed to intimidate rather than protect. Words spread quickly, igniting anger that threatened to fracture the fragile unity Bumpy had worked so hard to maintain. Crowds gathered outside the building where the incident occurred, their voices rising with frustration, and reporters arrived, hoping to capture a scene that would confirm the worst stereotypes about Harlem. Bumpy arrived quietly, his presence enough to slow the surge of emotion. He did not scold the crowd or dismiss their pain. Instead, he acknowledged the injustice with a calm gravity that allowed people to feel seen without encouraging escalation. His words were few, but his tone carried an unshakable certainty that dignity must remain the foundation of every response. Dutch stood slightly behind him, observing the way Bumpy's composure transformed the atmosphere. The crowd, once restless, gradually settled into attentive silence, listening for guidance rather than demanding immediate action. Dutch realized that power did not always come from forceful gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it came from the ability to hold a space steady when everything around it threatened to collapse. For a man accustomed to swift decisions and bold moves, the patience required in this moment felt foreign, yet he found himself respecting it more deeply than he expected. Days later, a mysterious letter arrived at a local church addressed to Bumpy. The handwriting was careful, almost deliberate, and the message inside warned that another public incident would occur within a week, one designed to provoke fear and division. The letter offered no names, only hints, leaving more questions than answers. Bumpy read it slowly, then folded it and placed it in his pocket without visible reaction. Those around him expected urgency or alarm, but he instead visited the grieving family from earlier events, reminding himself of the human faces behind every rumor and every threat. He believed that clarity often emerged not from chasing shadows, but from grounding oneself in purpose. The city grew heavier with anticipation as the seventh day approached. Even the weather seemed to conspire with the tension, gray clouds hanging low over Harlem like an unspoken warning. Children played closer to their doorsteps, shopkeepers kept radios turned low to catch every news update, and elders gathered on stoops exchanging quiet prayers. Bumpy spent long evenings speaking with pastors and community leaders, not to plan retaliation, but to prepare a response that would challenge injustice without feeding the narrative others hoped to create. He encouraged them to think beyond immediate anger, to imagine an action so dignified and unified that it would leave critics with nothing to exploit. Dutch watched these preparations with a mixture of admiration and unease. He had seen plans formed in secret rooms before, but this was different. It was open, transparent, rooted in the belief that visibility itself could become a shield. One night he confronted Bumpy gently, asking whether such restraint might be mistaken for weakness by those who thrived on intimidation. Bumpy paused before answering, his eyes reflecting the glow of a nearby street lamp. He said that true strength was measured not by how fiercely one reacted, but by how firmly one refused to become what others expected. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, leaving Dutch thoughtful and unusually silent. As the anticipated day arrived, Harlem awoke to a strange stillness. Newsboys moved quietly along the sidewalks, their usual calls softened, and a sense of watchful waiting hung over every block. The predicted incident unfolded not with violence, but with calculated humiliation aimed at provoking outrage, a public act that drew crowds and cameras within minutes. People looked to Bumpy, searching for direction, their emotions balanced between grief and fury. He stood at the edge of the gathering, his posture calm, his eyes steady, absorbing the scene without allowing it to overwhelm him. Dutch remained nearby, his presence less guarded than before, as though he too had chosen to stand not above the community but beside it. Instead of reacting immediately, Bumpy asked everyone to step back and listen. His voice was soft, yet it carried across the murmuring crowd with quiet authority. He spoke about the power of witness, about how injustice lost its strength when faced with unity rather than chaos. He suggested that instead of dispersing in anger, they remain present together, allowing the world to see a community defined not by rage but by unwavering dignity. The idea felt radical in its simplicity, and for a moment no one moved, uncertain whether such restraint could truly shift the narrative. Then one person nodded, followed by another, until the crowd settled into a collective stillness that felt almost sacred. Reporters, expecting confrontation, found themselves documenting something far more powerful, a gathering defined by calm, resolve. The tension did not disappear, but it transformed, shifting from explosive anger into a quiet force that refused to be ignored. Dutch watched as even skeptical onlookers lowered their voices, drawn into the atmosphere Bumpy had created. He realized that this was the turning point not just for Harlem, but for his own understanding of influence. A moment when patience revealed itself as a deeper form of courage. As evening fell, candles began to appear in windows, their light reflecting across the damp pavement like scattered stars. The act was unplanned yet instinctive, a silent gesture of solidarity that spread block by block until the entire street glowed. Bumpy walked slowly among the people, offering gentle words and steady nods reminding them that dignity could shine brighter than any attempt to diminish it. Dutch followed at a distance, watching how strangers reached out to one another, how the quiet unity of the moment carried more power than any confrontation ever could. When the last candle was lit, a hush settled over Harlem, unlike anything either man had witnessed before. The city did not erupt. It breathed, steady and unbroken, refusing to be defined by those who sought to provoke fear. Bumpy paused beneath a street lamp, his expression unchanged, yet filled with a quiet pride that needed no declaration. Dutch approached him slowly, standing beside him in silence as the glow of hundreds of candles reflected in their eyes. For the first time, it felt as though the neighborhood itself had become a voice too strong to be dismissed, and both men understood that the real battle ahead would not be fought with force, but with the enduring power of unity. The candles burned long after midnight, their fading glow leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than noise. Harlem awoke the next morning changed in a way no newspaper could capture. People walked slower, greeting one another with knowing glances that spoke of shared strength. Yet beneath that calm lived an unease that refused to disappear. Patrol cars lingered at corners longer than usual. Reporters wandered the streets searching for signs of conflict that never came, and unfamiliar faces watched from doorways with an interest that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Bumpy Johnson noticed everything without appearing to notice anything, his composure acting like a shield that allowed him to move through the neighborhood without feeding the tension gathering around it. Word began to spread that the quiet unity of the vigil had unsettled those who expected chaos. Some figures who had hoped to provoke a spectacle now found themselves scrambling to reshape the narrative, whispering that Harlem's calm was only temporary, that sooner or later anger would rise again. Bumpy heard these rumors without reacting. He spent long hours visiting community leaders, not to warn them of danger, but to remind them of the power they had already demonstrated. Every conversation felt like a thread woven into a larger tapestry, each voice strengthening the sense that Harlem could define itself rather than be defined by outsiders. Dutch Schultz, meanwhile, found himself caught between worlds that no longer felt as certain as they once had. His associates questioned why he spent so much time walking beside Bumpy, suggesting that such a partnership would be misunderstood by both sides. Dutch did not answer them directly. Instead, he returned to Harlem more frequently, drawn by the quiet resilience he witnessed there. He watched Bumpy speak with elders on stoops and children outside corner stores, always with the same calm dignity, always listening before offering guidance. It unsettled Dutch in a way he struggled to explain, forcing him to reconsider whether influence meant control or responsibility. One evening, a young journalist approached Bumpy outside a bookstore, her notebook filled with questions about the recent vigil and its impact. She expected dramatic statements, perhaps anger or defiance, but Bumpy responded with measured words about unity and respect, refusing to let the story become a spectacle. He spoke about Harlem not as a battleground, but as a living community shaped by courage and compassion. The journalist left with more questions than answers, sensing that the real story lay not in a single moment, but in the steady transformation unfolding beneath the surface. The fragile calm shattered days later when a public gathering intended to celebrate neighborhood art was disrupted by an act of humiliation directed at a respected elder. The incident felt calculated, designed to reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal. Crowds gathered quickly, voices rising with outrage, and cameras arrived hoping to capture the spark of confrontation they had been waiting for. Bumpy arrived quietly, his presence cutting through the noise like a steady breath in a storm. He did not rush toward the center. Instead, he observed the faces around him, reading the mood of the crowd. Understanding that one wrong word could unravel everything they had built. Dutch stood at the edge of the gathering, his expression unreadable as he watched the tension escalate. For a moment, it seemed as though the situation might spiral beyond control, the crowd's anger balanced on a fragile edge. Then Bumpy stepped forward and spoke only a few sentences, reminding everyone present that dignity was not something granted by others, but something chosen in every moment. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, yet it carried across the crowd with undeniable authority. The anger did not vanish, but it shifted, transforming into a focused silence that allowed people to stand together without losing themselves to chaos. In the days that followed, Harlem's unity began to attract attention from unexpected places. Faith leaders from other neighborhoods visited, offering support and admiration for the way the community had responded to repeated provocations. Some officials who had once dismissed local concerns now arrived with cautious respect, realizing that the narrative they had relied on no longer held power. Bumpy met each visitor with the same composed humility, never seeking praise, always redirecting attention toward the people whose resilience made the transformation possible. Dutch watched these interactions with growing respect, recognizing that Bumpy's strength lay not in commanding attention, but in elevating others, yet beneath the progress lingered a shadow. Anonymous letters appeared again, this time hinting at a final attempt to fracture the unity Harlem had achieved. The messages carried a tone of frustration, as though those behind them could not understand why their efforts had failed to ignite the chaos they expected. Bumpy read each letter carefully, refusing to let fear guide his actions. Instead, he gathered community leaders and proposed a bold idea. Rather than reacting to threats, they would host an open forum inviting voices from every side of the city to witness Harlem's strength firsthand. The suggestion sparked debate, some fearing it would expose the neighborhood to further scrutiny. But Bumpy's calm confidence gradually won them over. The forum took place in a grand hall filled with music, poetry, and heartfelt speeches that celebrated resilience rather than resentment. Dutch attended quietly. The atmosphere felt electric, not with anger, but with a sense of possibility that challenged long-held assumptions about power and influence. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing moments that defied the narratives they had come expecting to confirm. Bumpy moved through the room like a steady anchor, offering encouragement without seeking the spotlight. Midway through the evening, a tense moment arose when a visitor attempted to provoke a heated exchange, questioning whether Harlem's calm was merely a facade. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Bumpy as if waiting for him to respond. He stepped forward slowly and spoke with quiet conviction, saying that true strength did not need to shout to be heard. His words carried a weight that dissolved the tension, leaving the provocateur without an audience for confrontation. The crowd responded not with applause, but with a respectful silence that felt more powerful than any ovation. As the night ended, Dutch approached Bumpy outside the hall, the glow of streetlights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement. He admitted that he had never witnessed influence exercised with such restraint, confessing that it challenged everything he thought he understood about leadership. Bumpy listened without judgment, offering only a thoughtful nod and a simple reminder that every person had the capacity to choose a different path. The exchange marked a subtle shift between them, transforming their alliance into something deeper, a mutual respect grounded in shared purpose rather than necessity. Harlem entered the following week with a sense of anticipation that felt almost electric. The threats hinted at in the letters never fully materialized, yet the community remained vigilant, aware that progress often invited resistance. Bumpy continued his quiet rounds, checking on families, encouraging young activists, and meeting with local officials to ensure that Harlem's voice remained impossible to ignore. Each day felt like a test of patience, a reminder that true change rarely arrived in dramatic bursts, but in steady, persistent steps forward. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the first notes of jazz drifted through the air, Bumpy stood beneath a familiar street lamp, reflecting on how far the neighborhood had come since the first whispers of injustice. Dutch joined him, his posture relaxed, his gaze thoughtful as he watched people move through the streets with renewed confidence. They spoke little, allowing the moment to exist without explanation, understanding that sometimes silence carried more meaning than words. Not because the challenges had disappeared, but because the people facing them had discovered a deeper strength within themselves. As the night deepened, a group of children ran past laughing, their joy echoing down the street like a promise of what the future could hold. Bumpy watched them with a faint smile, his composure unchanged, yet softened by hope. Dutch followed his gaze, realizing that the true power of the past weeks lay not in any single event, but in the transformation of a community that refused to surrender its dignity. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with unseen challenges and hidden tests, but for the first time both men sensed that Harlem's story was no longer defined by the shadows of injustice alone. Instead, it had become a testament to resilience, a living example of how quiet strength could reshape even the most complicated narratives. Winter arrived slowly over Harlem, not with a sudden storm, but with a steady chill that crept into the streets and settled along the rooftops like a silent observer. Shaped by weeks of unity and resilience that had transformed the way people looked at one another. Conversations lingered longer on sidewalks, laughter returned to corners that once felt tense. And yet beneath the warmth of community, there remained an awareness that the struggle for dignity was never truly finished. Bumpy Johnson walked through this new Harlem with the same composed grace that had guided him from the beginning, his quiet presence a reminder that strength could exist without spectacle. The anonymous letters had stopped arriving, but their absence created its own suspense, like the pause before a final note in a song. Some believed the threats had faded, while others sensed that those who once tried to provoke fear were simply waiting for a different opportunity. Bumpy refused to assume either outcome. He continued meeting with pastors, artists, and young leaders, encouraging them to focus not on what might happen, but on what they could build together. His calm determination kept the community grounded, even as the city beyond Harlem watched with curiosity, unsure how to interpret a neighborhood that refused to respond to injustice with chaos. Dutch Schultz's visits became quieter, less about observation and more about reflection. He walked beside Bumpy through narrow streets where jazz melodies drifted from apartment windows, listening to stories from elders who remembered Harlem before the lights and crowds. He began to understand that influence did not come from controlling a place, but from honoring its spirit. Their conversations grew deeper, moving beyond strategy into questions of legacy and redemption. Dutch admitted that he had once measured success by power alone, but witnessing Harlem's transformation forced him to reconsider what truly mattered. One evening, as snow threatened to fall, a public hearing was announced downtown to address complaints about recent events involving Harlem's residents. Many feared the gathering would be little more than a formality designed to quiet criticism without offering real change. Community members urged Bumpy to attend, believing his voice carried the weight of everything they had endured. He agreed, not as a gesture of defiance, but as an opportunity to stand calmly in a room that rarely listened to people like him. Dutch offered to accompany him, understanding that the moment represented more than politics. It was a test of whether dignity could reshape perception, even in spaces resistant to it. The hearing hall felt cold and formal, its high ceilings echoing with murmured conversations as officials prepared their notes. Reporters filled the back rows, expecting tension, perhaps even confrontation, yet when Bumpy entered the room, he carried himself with such quiet composure that the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. He did not rush to the front or seek attention. He waited patiently, listening to each speaker, absorbing their words with thoughtful stillness. When his turn came, he spoke not about anger but about responsibility, reminding everyone present that communities flourished when treated with respect rather than suspicion. His voice remained calm, steady, and measured, leaving little room for dismissal. Dutch watched from the side, surprised by how silence followed Bumpy's words. The officials who had once spoken confidently now seemed unsure of their responses, confronted with a narrative that challenged their assumptions without attacking their authority. Bumpy concluded with a simple statement about dignity being the foundation of justice, then returned to his seat without expecting applause. The room remained quiet for several seconds, a rare moment when power shifted not through force but through clarity. Even those who disagreed with him could not ignore the strength behind his restraint. News of the hearing spread quickly through Harlem, carried by radios and whispered through doorways. People gathered in cafes to discuss what it meant, their voices filled with cautious hope. Some believed real change might finally begin, while others worried that promises would fade once attention moved elsewhere. Bumpy did not offer predictions. Instead, he encouraged everyone to continue supporting one another, reminding them that the unity they had built mattered more than any single decision made in a distant office. His focus remained on strengthening the bonds within Harlem rather than chasing recognition from outside it. As the days passed, a new challenge emerged when a group of outsiders attempted to stage a dramatic protest designed to provoke confrontation. Their arrival threatened to undo the calm that had defined recent weeks, drawing crowds and cameras eager for spectacle. Bumpy arrived quietly, his presence steadying the community once again. He spoke with the organizers calmly, urging them to consider the impact of their actions on the people who live there every day. Instead of escalating tensions, he suggested a different path and open dialogue that allowed voices to be heard, without turning the neighborhood into a stage for conflict. The turning point came when Bumpy stepped forward and invited everyone present to share a moment of silence for those who had suffered injustice, regardless of background or belief. The request felt simple, almost fragile, yet it transformed the atmosphere instantly. Voices faded, cameras lowered, and for a brief moment, the street became a space of reflection rather than confrontation. Dutch watched in awe as the silence spread through the crowd, replacing anger with something deeper, an understanding that dignity could unite even those who disagreed. It was not a dramatic victory, but it was powerful in its restraint, proving once again that Bumpy's strength lay in his ability to shift the energy of a room with only a few words. Winter's first snowfall arrived that evening, covering Harlem in a soft blanket of white that reflected the glow of streetlights like scattered stars. Children laughed as they ran through the snow, their joy echoing down the streets, and neighbors gathered to share warm drinks and quiet conversations. Bumpy walked slowly through the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces, his calm smile revealing a rare moment of peace. Dutch joined him beneath a street lamp, the falling snow softening the edges of the world around them. They spoke about the journey that had brought them here, about how unlikely their alliance once seemed, and about the lessons they had learned from a community that refused to surrender its dignity. As the season deepened, subtle changes began to appear across the city. Officials visited Harlem more frequently, not with suspicion, but with a willingness to listen. Artists found new opportunities to share their work, and local businesses experienced a renewed sense of support. The transformation was not sudden or perfect, but it carried the quiet momentum of something lasting. Bumpy remained humble throughout. always redirecting praise toward the people who stood beside him during the most difficult moments. Dutch, too, began to change, choosing his actions more carefully, influenced by the steady example he had witnessed over the past months. One night, after attending a small gathering at a church, Bumpy stepped outside to find the street empty, except for the soft crunch of snow beneath his shoes. He paused beneath the familiar street lamp that had become a silent witness to so many turning points. The air felt calm, almost reflective, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. Dutch approached quietly, standing beside him without speaking, the two men sharing a silence filled with understanding rather than tension. The city around them seemed to rest, as though acknowledging that something meaningful had been achieved. The emotional resolution arrived not with celebration, but with a quiet gesture that spoke louder than words. The grieving family whose pain had sparked the first wave of unity invited Bumpy and Dutch to a small gathering in their home. There were no speeches, only shared stories, soft laughter, and tears that carried both sorrow and gratitude. In that intimate space, the journey of the past weeks felt complete, not because every injustice had been erased, but because dignity had been restored in ways that could not be measured by headlines. Bumpy listened as the family expressed their thanks, responding with humility, reminding them that their strength had inspired the entire community. When the evening ended, he stepped back into the snowy street, the world quiet and still around him. The journey had changed Harlem, changed Dutch, and perhaps even changed the way the city itself understood justice. Yet Bumpy carried himself exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, respectful, quietly powerful. As he walked away beneath the glow of the street lamp, the snow falling gently around him, the neighborhood seemed to breathe with renewed hope, its story no longer defined by fear, but by the enduring power of dignity chosen again and again.